Sometimes revenge doesn't roar. It whispers one word, no. In a world obsessed with second chances and redemption arcs, Caitlin Clark chose silence over spectacle. When the legendary Geno Auriemma came crawling back with $1 million offer years after dismissing her as just another hopeful, she didn't rant, she didn't gloat. She simply said no. And that one word hit harder than any headline, any dunk, any championship ring. To outsiders, it looked insane. Who turns down 7 figures for just a few weeks of basketball? But this wasn't about money. It was about power. The invisible kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. For decades, Geno had been the gatekeeper of women's basketball, the man whose call could make or break a career. When he ignored a young Clark during recruitment, that silence defined her. Years later, when the tables turned, she gave it back to him, cold, calm, and final. Her decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was something deeper: dignity. The quiet confidence of someone who built her empire from nothing and no longer needed validation from the old guard. That no didn't just end a negotiation, it ended an era. It was the sound of the torch passing not by ceremony but by consequence. And the beauty of it? She didn't have to say a single cruel word. She didn't have to tweet, argue, or prove herself anymore. The proof was already there in the sold-out arenas, the record-breaking broadcasts, the millions of fans who had chosen her over the system. One word changed everything. Not because it was loud, but because it came from someone who no longer needed permission to speak. But to understand how powerful that no truly was, you have to know who she said it to. For more than 3 decades, one name defined women's basketball: Geno Auriemma. 11 national championships, dozens of All-Americans, and a reputation so commanding that his approval could launch a career before the player even stepped onto a college court. He wasn't just a coach, he was the architect of an empire, the kingmaker who decided who mattered and who didn't. To be chosen by Geno meant more than joining UConn. It meant being written into the sport's history. His players became legends, Taurasi Stewart Moore icons molded in his image. Reporters hung on his every word, sponsors lined up behind his recruits, and analysts treated his opinions as gospel. Even rival coaches often bowed to his dominance, knowing that fighting against the machine he built was like trying to stop a storm with an umbrella. He had a formula: talent, obedience, discipline, and he expected the world to play by his rules. If Geno called, you picked up. If he didn't, your dream school might as well have been a locked door. Over time, his power stretched far beyond the hardwood. Networks courted him for commentary. Endorsement deals followed his stars. Parents whispered his name like a prayer during recruitment season, hoping their daughters might be chosen next. But somewhere between the titles and the trophies, that power became entitlement. The kind that blinds a man to what's coming next. When you sit at the top long enough, you start to believe you'll stay there forever. You forget that every era, no matter how golden, eventually ends. Geno Auriemma wasn't prepared for someone who didn't need his validation, someone who would rewrite the rules he created. But every empire eventually meets the one it underestimated. When Caitlin Clark was a teenager lighting up high school gyms in Iowa, everyone assumed her path was already written. The best players went to UConn, that was the rule. The same program that produced legends, the place every girl with a basketball dreamed of wearing across her chest. Clark had the stats, the swagger, and the spark. She was supposed to be next in line, but the call never came. No invitation, no meeting, not even a polite email. For the greatest recruiter in the history of women's basketball, Geno Auriemma's silence was deafening. Later, he'd shrug it off with an excuse that felt more like a dismissal. He said UConn already had Paige Bueckers and didn't need another point guard. On paper, that sounded reasonable. But to anyone paying attention, it was arrogance disguised as logic. Because this wasn't about roster fit, it was about belief. Geno simply didn't see her. He didn't believe she was worth chasing. And for a coach who prided himself on spotting generational talent before anyone else, that indifference cut deeper than rejection ever could. He didn't just close a door, he made sure she knew it had never been open. Clark never complained. She didn't post a tweet or take a jab in an interview. She just absorbed it quietly. That's the thing about truly great players: they collect disrespect, like fuel. Every slight becomes kindling. Every doubt becomes fire. She didn't need revenge yet. She just needed a place to prove him wrong. And when the time came to choose, she didn't chase prestige or legacy. She chose the one program that believed in her when the rest of the world looked the other way. That choice, Iowa, wasn't just a decision. It was a declaration. When Caitlin Clark committed to Iowa, the basketball world barely blinked. To insiders, it was a quiet headline, a top recruit choosing comfort over competition. In elite circles, Iowa wasn't a power school. It didn't have UConn's mystique, South Carolina's trophies, or Stanford's pipeline of legends. For many, it looked like career suicide, the kind of move that guaranteed great stats, maybe some highlight clips, but no real legacy. But Clark saw something nobody else did. Iowa wasn't a fallback. It was freedom. A place where she could play her way unfiltered, without being molded into anyone else's system. From her very first game in Iowa City, you could feel the difference. Her threes came from the logo, her passes defied logic, and her energy turned sleepy arenas into electric theaters. She didn't just play basketball, she performed it. And people noticed. Crowds doubled, then tripled. Within a season, Iowa games were selling out nationwide. Networks started shifting schedules just to broadcast her matchups. Highlight reels that once struggled for clicks now exploded across social media, breaking view records night after night. By her junior year, Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player, she was a movement. She flipped the narrative from underdog to unmissable. Every shot was a statement you don't need the system to succeed. You just need belief. The so-called consolation prize had become the epicenter of women's basketball. Sponsors chased her. Kids wore her jersey. Analysts compared her impact to Jordan Curry and even LeBron. The dynasty schools looked on stunned, silent, and maybe a little afraid, because for the first time in decades, the sports spotlight had shifted away from the empire that used to control it. And that's when Geno started feeling the ground shift beneath him. For a while, Geno Auriemma tried to pretend Caitlin Clark didn't exist, but the louder her name got, the harder that became. Reporters started asking him about her in interviews, and that's when the mask slipped. With the trademark smirk he'd perfected over decades of dominance, Geno brushed her off. He called her a kid playing in the driveway, a subtle jab that said more than it sounded. To him, Clark's brilliance was just flash, hype, a circus act, not real basketball. At first, fans thought it was typical Geno bravado, but the digs kept coming. Each time her name surfaced, there was another sly remark, another backhanded compliment. Then came the moment that broke the illusion completely. During a 2024 interview, he mocked Clark's supporters, calling them delusional and clueless about the game. He claimed they were hurting women's basketball by hyping her too much, as if believing in her was some kind of crime. The backlash was instant. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before suddenly found themselves defending her. Analysts called his comments petty, outdated, and tone-deaf. Even former players whispered that Geno's words weren't confidence, they were fear. The sport was changing faster than he could control, and for the first time, he wasn't at the center of it. Because here's what he missed. Clark's rise wasn't just about basketball. It was about a movement, fans, families, and young girls who finally saw a player that made the game feel alive again. She wasn't competing against Geno's legacy. She was building something entirely new, but he couldn't see that. To him, her popularity was a threat, not progress. It wasn't just criticism anymore, it was panic disguised as authority. Yet while he talked, Clark stayed silent, and that silence became her sharpest weapon. While Geno filled microphones with excuses and thinly veiled jabs, Caitlin Clark never said a word. She didn't clap back. She didn't post a cryptic tweet. She didn't need to. Every night she stepped on the court, her game did the talking, louder and sharper than any insult he could throw. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was precision. The same fans he called delusional kept believing. They bought tickets, filled arenas, and turned every broadcast into an event. And as the season unfolded, those clueless fans turned out to be prophets. Clark didn't just survive her rookie year, she conquered it. She shattered attendance records, became the face of the league, and walked away with Rookie of the Year honors. Not long after she was named to the All-WNBA first team, a feat few rookies in history had ever achieved. Then came the moment that made Geno's words age like spoiled milk, the MVP votes. Caitlin Clark finished 4th in the entire league, exactly where those delusional fans had predicted she would. The same prediction he mocked had become fact, and the irony couldn't have been written better if she tried. But the best part, she didn't rub it in. She didn't boast or celebrate his downfall. She just smiled, hugged her teammates, and kept playing. That's the kind of revenge that cuts deepest, the kind that doesn't seek to humiliate but simply proves you wrong by existing. Every logo three-pointer, every no-look assist, every sold-out game was a quiet echo of that unspoken message. You could have called me. You didn't. And now the empire that once ignored her was bowing to the queen it failed to recognize. But the story wasn't done. The final blow was still to come, wrapped in a $1 million offer. By the time Caitlin Clark became the most talked about name in women's basketball, even the people who once doubted her couldn't ignore the numbers. Sold out arenas, global sponsorships, viewership records that eclipsed entire professional leagues. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, one name quietly resurfaced: Geno Auriemma. According to reports, his camp reached out with a stunning offer over $1 million for a short-term exhibition deal that would bring him and Clark back into the same orbit. On paper, it sounded poetic, the old master joining forces with the star he once overlooked. But beneath the surface, it was desperation disguised as opportunity. Geno didn't need a player, he needed redemption, a chance to remind the world that he still mattered. And when the offer landed on her table, Clark didn't hesitate. No drawn-out negotiations, no meetings, no counteroffers. Just one word: no. That answer hit harder than any buzzer beater. It wasn't about the money she had more than enough. It wasn't even personal anymore. It was principle. The system that once decided who got to be great was now asking for a piece of her greatness, and she declined with quiet grace. In that single moment, every power dynamic flipped. The gatekeeper had become the one seeking entry. The prodigy he dismissed had built an empire of her own, and she didn't need anyone's blessing to keep building. Clark's refusal wasn't vengeful, it was symbolic. A line drawn in history between the old world and the new. And when word got out, fans didn't see arrogance. They saw evolution. That's when everyone realized the power had shifted for good. When the dust settled, the picture was unmistakable. The man who once controlled the narrative, who decided which players mattered and which ones didn't, was now just another spectator watching from the sidelines. Geno Auriemma had spent a lifetime building the rules of women's basketball, and Caitlin Clark had rewritten them without ever asking for permission. He used to command the spotlight. Now, he was standing in its reflection. For decades, players waited for his validation for that Yukon call that signaled arrival. But Clark had proven that the game no longer revolved around approval. It revolved around performance authenticity and connection, things no institution could monopolize. She didn't climb his ladder, she built her own. And in doing so, she opened the door for every player who would come after her to dream on their own terms. For women's basketball, it wasn't just a power shift, it was a cultural reset. The fans were now part of the movement. Social media sold out arenas, record-breaking viewership, all fueled by a new kind of hero who didn't wait to be chosen. Clark's rise showed that influence now flowed from the players outward, not from the system down. And that's what made Geno's fall so poetic. He didn't lose a championship. He lost control of the story, the spotlight, and the authority he once took for granted. Caitlin Clark didn't have to destroy his empire. She just outgrew it. Sometimes the loudest revenge is silence, and Caitlin Clark mastered it. Her no became more than rejection. It became revolution. So, what do you think was this revenge or evolution?